We're joined today by Dr. Kevin Knuth, Associate Professor of Physics at the University of Albany. Dr. Knuth has over 2 decades of experience in machine learning algorithms for astrophysics, Bayesian probability theory, information theory, robotics, signal processing, neuroscience, nonlinear dynamics, quantum mechanics, and many other areas. He's also the editor of the peer-review open access journal Entropy, as well as being a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. He joins us today to discuss his quest for evidence-based answers for the UAP phenomenon. So Kevin, welcome. And let me start out by asking, what sparked your interest in UAPs? Is this something recent, or is this kind of a longer term pursuit that's getting more public visibility now because of all the news headlines that we're seeing about UAPs?
Right. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, certainly. I've always, since I was a kid, I was always interested in UFOs, and I remember watching In Search of with Leonard Nimoy back in the 1970s, and there were often several UFO related accounts and on that show and Unsolved Mysteries, and I always thought they were quite interesting. My grandfather, Carl Knuth, had left for me, had collected a bunch of newspaper articles from the Apollo missions, the Apollo 11 missions. So I've gotten headlines for the moon landing and saved these. And he gave these to me, and I was going through them and looking through them, and I found an article, kind of fell out, that was from the magazine National Fisherman. And I thought, wow, what is this? This got mixed in. But it was an article about a UFO sighting in the let's see, I don't remember exactly which one they started out with, but the article's from 1967, so around the same time. And it's a UFO sighting that happened in 1960 involving 5 different ships. So it was seen by multiple observers. And this UFO came out of the water and hovered next to one of the ships and then took off and flew over the other ships. And so I was really curious about this. I thought this was interesting. And this article actually goes into multiple other sightings that go back into the 1800s, which I thought was very strange. So I'd always been interested in this topic. And it wasn't until I got into graduate school. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I went to Montana State to get my master's degree in physics. And at Montana State University, it would have been in September of 1988. I just started graduate school, and there was about 2 weeks in, there was a cattle mutilation on one of the nearby ranches in Bozeman, Montana. And I'd never heard of a cattle mutilation before. Growing up in Wisconsin, I've heard of cow tipping, but who mutilates cows? That's horrible. So there was this big discussion amongst the graduate students in the department. And most of us were trying to, we were the new graduate students, so we were trying to figure out what kind of crazy place did we all just move to and commit spending several years of our lives at. So we had this heated discussion, and one of the professors came out of his office, and he came down to see what we were talking about, and he said, oh yeah, that happens here, every now and then there's a cattle mutilation. It's very weird, and the news media finds there's people who often report UFOs associated with them. So the 2 things that the news people like to talk about are UFOs and Satanists, and it never really gets resolved until the next cattle mutilation. And of course, that didn't help us feel any better. It was still kind of strange. And then he said, but what's really strange? He said, I have some friends who work up on the ICBM missile sites up at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And they have problems with UFOs flying over the nuclear missiles and shutting them down. And he told us this, and we were just, how do you respond to that? And that's weird. And he he walked away, and I'll be honest, our answer was we laughed really hard. And that kind of became a running joke that anytime anybody said something strange, one of the other students would interject, well, something really strange. And we would tell that story. So that was kind of a running joke. And I'm not sure, I don't think any of us really believed it, because, how is that possible? How can you have an aircraft incursion on a nuclear weapons site and nobody does anything about it? You don't hear about this on the news, or there's in some big, turn into some big event. So it just stayed in the back of my mind. And it wasn't until years later, it was probably around 2016 or so, I was preparing for an astronomy class, and I had some we were going to talk about astrobiology. And I had some students interested in the possibilities of alien life and whether they could visit Earth. And so it was before class, and I was just poking around on the internet and trying to figure out exactly what I could talk about. And I stumbled on the press conference held by Robert Hastings at the National Press Club. I think it was from 2010, where he had interviewed 6 individuals, several of whom had worked at Malmstrom Air Force Base, the same Air Force Base. And they were discussing UFO incursions at nuclear weapon sites. And I was just blown away. I thought, wow, my God, I heard about this 30 years ago from a physics professor. And he was talking about it in 1988, was talking about it as if it was going on at that time. He said they are having problems. But these people like Robert Salas are talking about events that happened in 1967. And I thought, this has got to be a real thing. You don't have stupid rumors like this flying around amongst professionals over several decades. And I really was puzzled. I thought, how can it be a real thing? How can nobody ever do anything about this? And then it really occurred to me, I thought, it's because everybody thinks it's ridiculous. Nobody does anything. So I thought, but it can't be ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. So that really piqued my interest. And then I started paying attention and reading up about UFOs, and as best I could. And it wasn't long after, I guess it was 2017, the next year or so, that Lou Elizondo came out and announced that he had worked for the ATIP program, and the videos were released, and then there it all was. So it all fell in. The timing was absolutely perfect.
Well, and it's interesting that you should mention that, because yeah, it does seem, I guess I would see this, I've seen the same thing where it started out, it's myth, legend, cultural stories that are kind of passed down. It's difficult to take a lot of it seriously. And then, yeah, right around 2017, it started making headlines. And it is interesting. A lot of times a story like this will kind of pop up, get a little news coverage, and then kind of go away. And with this one, it just keeps growing and growing and growing and building momentum. Now, so if I could jump into it more recently, and again, you're the editor-in-chief of the journal Entropy. So in September 2019, this is more recent, you helped publish Estimating Flight Characteristics of Anomalous Unidentified Aerial Vehicles. And that was actually how I first was introduced to your work. And it's a very rigorous peer-reviewed paper. You wrote that with 2 other individuals, Robert Powell and Peter Reali. And in that paper, you described UAPs as reportedly being structured craft that exhibit impossible flight characteristics. I'm wondering, could you elaborate a little bit more on that paper and what that statement means in terms of structured craft that exhibit impossible flight characteristics?
Right, certainly. Well, after those videos were released, I spent a lot of time poring over them, trying to figure out what can I glean from these videos. They're difficult because the images are blurry. They're infrared images. They're going to be blurry to some degree. So that's not surprising. It's expected. And it was a little frustrating because when you hear the account from David Fravor, in the first encounters with the Tic Tac UFOs, they talk about these things as, I think he would one point described it as if it was a ping pong ball bouncing around inside of a jar, and the way that they were zipping back and forth. And in almost instantaneously changing direction. And, you know, you look at these videos and you don't see any of that. And I think, well, you know, the Navy released videos, which is great. It appears that they released the most boring videos they could find. And it really did look like that. Because none of these videos exhibited any of the bizarre behaviors that the pilots had been reporting. And so the one that struck me, or the segment that struck me, was the end of the Nimitz video, where the targeting computer loses track as the object accelerates away to the left. And I wasn't sure how much analysis could be done, because we, you know, throughout the video, the camera's moving around, following the thing, the plane's moving, a lot of stuff, we just don't have all that information. So it's going to be hard to find out what the object is doing. So I did realize, though, going over it frame by frame, I realized, though, the last 35 frames or so, as the thing leaves the screen, the plane isn't turning, he's not banking, the camera is not gimbaling, so everything is basically stationary as the object, as the computer loses track and the object takes off. So I thought, well, we could at least try to estimate the acceleration here. And so I worked to do that. And I had done that pretty much before I went to the meeting at SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. They had a meeting in March of that year. And I went and presented on something else, actually. I talked about relativistic travel, space travel. But Robert Powell and Peter Reali had already done an analysis of the Nimitz video as well. And they had estimated accelerations as well. And those accelerations agreed with what I was estimating. So, you know, we got to talking about it, and I said, I think we could probably publish a paper this way. We could get a paper into the scientific community. I had been, to do my analysis, I was using Bayesian data analysis techniques to test the different models. And so I had a model of where the object accelerated away, where it accelerated partway and then coasted, and various, you know, whether it moved just to the left or moved to the left and away or left and towards. And I had different models I had tested, and I used Bayesian statistics to do that. And there was a conference coming up that summer on Bayesian statistics. So I thought, well, that's a good place to get this in. It's a good application. I mean, it's kind of a sneaky trick, right? I'm presenting this as an application of a statistical technique, but then the application is this bizarre thing that nobody would normally allow in a scientific conference. So it was, you know, I had been attending this conference for about 20 years at this point, so I wasn't worried about this. I knew most of the people at the conference, and I knew if I present this properly and go through the data analysis, this is it. I mean, this should work very well as an introduction. And so that's basically what I did. And so I presented it at the conference, and it was very well received, which was nice. Except for one of my colleagues and friends, he was quite upset by the whole thing and stood up. He goes, "I won't believe it. I'll never." He was very adamant about this. He said, "You could give me a tour through an alien spaceship, and I still won't believe it." And I pointed out how, you know, some of my other colleagues were upset at his response and thought it rather unprofessional. But I pointed out, but this is the response that we get typically from the scientific community and from everybody. This is the difficulty we all face as people when having to change your worldviews. It's difficult for people. So it was well received at the conference, and the conference organizers invited me to write a longer paper that would go into the journal. So the journal Entropy, for which I'm an editor-in-chief, supported that conference, and the conference organizers were the guest editors for a special issue that basically had papers covered from that conference. And so So Robert Powell and Peter and I wrote a longer paper and then submitted for review, and it went through the normal journal reviewing process, and the guest editors accepted it. So
now
that's how we got it published. So I'm not sure it would have been easy to publish it any other way.
And I would say that was a groundbreaking paper in many ways, right? I mean, again, like you said, I think we call it the giggle factor, but there are probably many different names for it. It's
Right.
difficult to get these ideas taken seriously, you know, and to do a paper like that and to apply scientific rigor to the analysis, again, I mean, what you've done and what the SCU is doing is just groundbreaking in terms of UFO research, because you're taking something that has been just out there and, you know, la la land with this giggle factor associated with it, and you're applying rigor to it. And now, so in this paper, the analysis that you did, you've described these craft as having estimated accelerations that range from 100 G to, you know, thousands of Gs, no disturbed air, you know, no observed air disturbance, no sonic booms, no evidence of excess heat. And then I thought it was also interesting to mention that the observed flight characteristics of these craft are consistent with flight characteristics required for interstellar travel. So the reason I mention this is a UAP by definition is unidentified, but it sounds like in that paper you're setting the stage to describe this as an intelligently controlled vehicle capable of space travel. How confident are you that that's the case?
At this point, I'm very confident. These objects were well observed by at least 6 pilots during that encounter. They were picked up on radar and for over the course of several days, about 100, you know, there were 100 events in total. 100 of these in total were picked up, about 10 or 20 at a time. So there were multiple events of these appearing on the radar on the USS Princeton. So these objects were well described by all of the pilots. We have a good idea of what they looked like. They were basically white butane tank shaped or tic tac shaped objects with little protrusions on the bottom. And that's basically all it was. So there's no flight surfaces. There's no observed means of propulsion. They're about as anomalous as you can get. And the accelerations are what really is fantastic. So as Fravor described them, as I mentioned earlier, described them as bouncing around like they were, you know, a ping pong ball in a glass jar. So he said it isn't that they slowed down and stopped and turned around. It's just they reversed direction almost instantaneously. And Lou Elizondo has referred to this as instantaneous acceleration. Although there I'd put a little caution in. It's instantaneous is what we mean is you can't measure it. It's too high of an acceleration to be able to measure. Now, when we estimated accelerations, we were, so for the video, that acceleration at the end of the video was about 75 Gs of acceleration. So 75 times the acceleration of gravity. It doesn't look that impressive because the object's rather far away. And it's accelerating partly away from the observer as well, away from the airplane. And I think that we were rather lucky because I suspect that had the US Navy actually analyzed the acceleration of that segment and known that it was accelerating that fast, I suspect they probably wouldn't have released it because it turned out there was just enough information there for us to figure out what it was doing. So we were really lucky in that respect. So that acceleration was about 75 G. We estimated several other accelerations during the course of those events from other observations. So from when Commander Fravor tried to approach the object, they were basically circling each other. And the object was mirroring his actions. So this was clearly intelligently controlled. The object was interacting with the pilot. So it's intelligently controlled to some degree. And when he tried to close that distance, that's when the object shot past his nose and took off. And he said that it was basically out of sight in about, I think it was 2 seconds is what he said. And it was a clear day. And so we were able to estimate, how far away is, 40-foot object, or if about 10 feet, if it's heading straight away from you, how far away is that object before you can't see it anymore? And we were actually able to estimate that. And from that case, we were able to obtain acceleration estimates that were, they were more than 100 G. They were on the order of 100 G, which is in agreement with what we see in the video. So that having that agreement was important. And then the most shocking aspect was what Senior Chief Kevin Day reported from radar. When he was observing these things would have first appeared at about 80,000 feet. They would show up on radar. That was about the ceiling for that radar system. And they would appear on radar. They would drop down to about 28,000 feet. And then they would track south from Catalina Island and San Clemente Island, southward at about 100 knots. So again, the objects are anomalous. They're moving. You've got an object heading south 100 knots at 28,000 feet. It's hard to go that slow at that altitude. There's not much air up there. You typically have to have much higher speeds. So they're anomalous in that sense for moving slowly, which is a different type of anomalous behavior, right? And he noted that in some cases they would basically drop from 28,000 feet to sea level. And when that happened, they would drop that 28,000 foot distance in about 0.78 seconds. So you basically are going from, if you just consider the motion in the vertical direction, you're going from rest in the vertical direction to having to accelerate to some speed to get down there. And then you're going to have to stop before you get to sea level. So you've got to accelerate again. So we were able to estimate the minimum acceleration of these objects. And the minimum acceleration occurs when you accelerate halfway and then decelerate the other half, right?
Okay.
And that you can show that. So now you've basically got a physics problem that is literally, it's a freshman level physics question. What is the acceleration? The object went from, traveled 28,000 feet. It did that by accelerating halfway and decelerating halfway. What is the acceleration? And the answer is quite shocking. The answer is about 5,000 times acceleration of gravity. So, okay. So that's really hard to get your head around. Why is that so shocking and anomalous? Well, let's just consider 1,000 times. Let's say it was 1,000 G. So it was 5 times more than that, of course. And let's imagine what would happen to a pilot. So imagine I'm piloting this craft. If we'll pretend it's a craft, and imagine somebody's in there. We'll be generous and say that the upper half of my body weighs 100 pounds, all right? Use nice round numbers. So if the upper half of my body weighs 100 pounds and we're going to accelerate at 1,000 G, how much is my body going to feel? How much weight is that going to feel like? Well, that's going to feel like 100,000 pounds, right? So what happens to the lower half of your body when the upper half of your body feels like it weighs 100,000 pounds?
Yeah.
You aren't going to hold up 100,000 pounds. So you literally are a puddle of goo by the time this maneuver is completed. So it's really very strange.
And one of the things that you'd written in this paper was that these UAPs appear to violate the laws in physics, in a number of different ways. Some of those include they don't have flight or control surfaces, visible means of propulsion, They appear to violate Newton's third law. They can operate. This is one that surprised me, but it's incredibly intriguing. Is they can operate in multiple media, right? The transmedium where they go from air to water and back, and they appear to do that agnostically of the medium. And again, there's no sonic booms or heat dumps, and again, as you've just stated, these kinds of accelerations, not only will the pilot not hold up, but I mean, any kind of airframe would collapse.
Your airframe won't hold up. That's right.
So, really what we're talking about, I mean, these are things that are so far beyond known physics and technology, that it's just insane. Now, I did want to touch, though, briefly on, I wanted to gather what your thoughts are. There are debunkers, there always are, with issues like this. And I've heard a number of possible, especially about the original videos that were released, right? The gimbal and go fast. People have said submarine launched weather balloons could be an explanation, remote controlled drones, some kind of electronic spoofing of naval tracking systems. Do you think any of these offer an explanation?
No, I think on the surface, when I've read these attempts to debunk the videos, they all do the same thing. They focus on one piece of information, and their explanation explains only that one piece. It doesn't explain the whole thing. So balloons released by submarines, yeah, they could have released 40-foot Tic Tac shaped balloons. Yeah, of course they could. And these things would go and go up and then hover, right? But they're not going to follow pilots around. They're not going to be able to accelerate. You can't, how do you accelerate a balloon at 5,000 G or 75 G even, which is what we see from the video. Drones. Yeah, the drones would be a possibility. Again, but you have a problem. You don't have flight surfaces. You don't have obvious propulsion mechanisms. You don't see any heat signatures from engines or exhaust, in the infrared videos. And again, the objects would have to accelerate at these extreme rates. Now, one criticism was that we did not know the size of the objects, and that's correct. We used to get that acceleration from the video, we used the estimated size given by the pilots. And Robert Powell and Peter Reali went into some detail in their lengthy report, where they actually considered what happens if you have different sizes. And they have a table that does this, but you can think about this rather simply. The size sets the scale for the acceleration and everything else. It's what allows you to figure out the distances, which figures out, so you can figure out how far it's traveled in that period of time. So let's say the pilots were really way, way off, right? How the question is, how wrong could the pilots be? And in Bayesian analysis, we would think of that as what we call the likelihood function. What's the likelihood you could have deviated from the correct value? And so if the object wasn't 40 feet long and was only 4 feet long, so a little 4-foot drone, right? And yeah, then the acceleration wouldn't be that high. Well, what would the acceleration be? Well, instead of 75 G, it would be 7.5 G. So it'd basically be 7 times the acceleration of gravity. And that drone would have been 10 times closer to the aircraft, right? And would have accelerated away at 7 times the acceleration of gravity. Still anomalous, because 7 times the acceleration of gravity is rather high. You don't see any exhaust in the video. You don't see any evidence of any heat being generated by engines. So it's not clear how the thing's accelerating, even if it was only 4 feet long and accelerated at 7 G. So I don't think those types of explanations hold up. Right.
Well, so Kevin,
you also mentioned electronic spoofing. Should I talk about that for a moment? Or
Yeah, and then the other thing that I had also wondered about, and I feel ridiculous even mentioning this, was remember back in the Blue Book days, they were talking about swamp gas, right? That was the big thing back then. But what is interesting is so swamp gas, the idea was that it could be electrically excited, and that's actually the explanation for ball lightning, except that ball lightning doesn't. I mean, typically it travels like, I think they set up to 100 feet, and then usually the methane ignites and it goes bang, So, but yeah, I mean, spoofing, I guess that would be another possibility somehow.
Yeah, so well, spoofing, you could possibly spoof electronically with the radar, but that doesn't explain the infrared video and what the pilots report. So again, a lot of these debunking explanations only handle part of the picture. What people often conveniently like to do is say, well, we can't trust witness reports, so we're not even going to try to explain any of that. We're just going to explain this little tiny observation. And yeah, but without the witness reports, you don't have context for that. And it's not useful.
I see what you're saying. So
those aren't good explanations. They don't really hold water.
So
electronic spoofing. So spoofing would only explain part of it. One of the reviewers of our paper actually came up with an interesting explanation, and that was, what if you had somebody using lasers and basically were ionizing the air, ionizing a patch of air and making it look like there was an object there. And so they said that ionized patch of air could possibly reflect radio waves, so it would explain the radar. It could explain, what the pilot saw, and it would heat the air, so you'd also have infrared video. So that's probably the best explanation attempt at debunking that I've heard. Of course, that comes from a scientist who knows that you have to explain all of the data, right? The problem with that is that they were too far away from shore for any shore-based lasers. So the lasers would have had to be on ships, and they knew that there were no other ships in the area. And even if the lasers were on ships, they would have to be, because the objects interacted with the pilots, you would need to be somehow tracking the pilots so that you could have the objects interact with them, right? And in that case, you would have to be using radar. And there was no other radar active in the area as well. So there'd be no way for somebody, somebody trying to trick them using lasers, because they'd have no way of mapping or figuring out what the pilots are doing, monitoring the pilots while directing the laser beams to create the imagery. So,
well, and I guess another thought on that too is like with the Catalina Island incident, some of these happened at night, right? And so if you had lasers,
right.
Presumably you would see beams as well as the ionization patch.
That's very possible. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, in terms of lasers, and this was really interesting. You've also done a presentation on this. You're going to be doing a presentation. I don't want to give too much of it away, but so you described a laser strike event. This is a different use of a laser. In this case, this was in Austin, Texas, back in 1975, and they used some rather complex instrumentation to record a laser bounce off a UAP or UFO, right? I'm wondering, could you explain this for us? This was what you, in the paper, you'd said this is how they could determine that it was a real physical object.
Right. So this is one example of a test to see whether it's physical. And this was performed by Ray Stanford, who was founded Starlight International, which was a group of scientists and engineers to study UFOs back in the 1970s. And on, let's see, this was December 10th, 1975. They had their equipment up and were basically monitoring, watching for UFOs. That's really all you can do. and they noticed an anomalous round white object approaching from the west-southwest. This was near Austin, Texas. It stopped and hovered for about 9 minutes. And they first wanted to be sure it wasn't an aircraft. So Ray Stanford phoned Bergstrom Air Force Base command post and talked to them about it. They said they were aware of the object, but they couldn't identify it. And he asked them if it would be all right for him to aim his laser beam at it. And they felt it was okay to put the laser beam on it. So I don't think that would happen nowadays, but they did back then. So after speaking to Bergstrom Air Force Base, the object started moving quickly. Ray got into action. He focused the laser, forgot to turn on the video camera, and but basically was taking still photos with long exposures. So he has the photograph of the track of the UFO, and then you can see in this track, you see this little blast where the laser beam actually hits the UFO, where it flies past the laser beam, and he bounces the laser beam off of it. So it was a little helium neon laser, and so it amounts to a nice demonstration that this is a physical object. This isn't just some, ball lightning or something like this. And in talking to him about this, it was interesting. He remarked on how afterwards he thought, yeah, this really wasn't a smart thing to do. What if they thought this was, if we were being malicious in some way?
Well, now, if it's okay, and in the laser strike, I don't recall if you identified in the paper what the shape was. But one of the things that I wanted to ask about, there are some areas for me, because like yourself, I've read a great deal about this, especially recently, and I may end up going off questions a little bit. I should apologize, but there are a lot of things that just make my brain hurt, I guess, and one of them is. So well, part of it is we have a 75-year history of UFOs, right? And some really big events, the UFO sightings in 1952, which they said were atmospheric weather events, which may not have been in hindsight. So we have this enormous history, but we're only really seriously looking at the last few years. And so that one of the things that's difficult is there's almost like this dichotomy, which is understandable, but we have to reconcile at some point. And then the other part is when we're talking about UAPs, it seems like we're primarily focused on this the tic tac, the cylinder shape, as well as maybe these glowing orbs that have been involved with, but then there are also traditional flying saucers that have been reported, and the black triangles and many other shapes. Do you have any thoughts on which ones are, I was gonna say which ones are more real or which ones are kind of the official tic tac? I mean, obviously these cylinders are, but the variability, I guess, is what causes me a lot of confusion. Are some of these more likely to be real, and the saucers are maybe more of a product of the imagination? I don't know.
Oh, these are all really good questions. There's the fact that we don't know what these things are, and that some of them, or most of these events have prosaic explanations, means that these things are lots of things, right? So I've seen several, and in fact, in the slides in that talk, I show pictures of UFOs that are actually birds. I point out how you can tell they're birds. So I've seen several pictures of birds that are thought to be UFOs. And so most objects that are seen that are called UFOs are identifiable and not interesting. So that's one of the first complications. So they are certainly not all interesting objects, or, as I called them, craft with impossible, capabilities. Some of them are, and interesting, and there is a diversity of shapes, and it's not clear what that what to make of that. And that my guess is there probably are a diverse variety of shapes of craft, if these are craft, which I'm now tending to favor that hypothesis. If you just look on the highway, you've got a diverse array of craft, right? You've got motorcycles to semis to buses to motorhomes to airstreamers, and so diversity is a natural thing, and I wouldn't be surprised if if there was a diversity of craft. It would be probably more suspicious if they were all the same. When I think about it this way. The other possibility is, we haven't touched on the extraterrestrial hypothesis yet, and that's, again, only a hypothesis, but if that is a factor, these craft may not all be coming from the same source. Some of these craft could be made by people here on Earth. Some of these craft could be made by non-human intelligences on Earth or elsewhere, and there could be multiple sources. So we don't really know. You look up you see a plane up in the sky. It could be Southwest Airlines. It could be American Airlines. It could be Icelandic Air, or El Al or something. Yeah.
That's an excellent point. And one of the things in the online groups, and again, this leaves the realm of science and goes into UFO culture, which is very messy. But
very messy, yeah.
One of the things that when I'd ask this question, the response that I usually get is, well, obviously it's multiple alien species, and that for me, that's, I guess that compounds the difficulty, right? Because well, to be completely honest with you, right now, I'm trying to accept the fact that this may be first contact, right? Or, 75 years of first contact, because apparently we're slow learners.
Protracted.
But yeah, like yourself, I'm going through these different ideas and saying, well, it can't be this, it can't be that, it probably isn't this, and yeah, so you mentioned the extraterrestrial hypothesis. That's kind of where it leads me as well. But the struggle that I have is accepting the fact that these are real, honest to God space aliens is difficult enough. Mm-hmm. But then to compound that by saying, and again, this is what I'm hearing online, is the black triangles, if they're not ours, they're from, one planet, the saucers are from another. That I have real trouble.
Not necessarily true. We don't have any evidence that they're extraterrestrial to begin with, and how would any of us know how to tell whether they come from one planet or another planet? That's going to require sitting down and going through their technology to see how similar it is. And even if it's similar, it doesn't mean that you still won't be able to decide.
I guess that's all down the road stuff, really, way down the road.
It amounts to, I think, my on-the-fly explanation of not knowing which country the airplane comes from is probably a good analogy.
Well, and it's an excellent
point. You have to do a lot more work than just look at these things, look at a photo of a light in the sky.
Yeah, and I should apologize for jumping way ahead in terms of the goals of the SCU and the things that you guys have focused on, because again, one of the things that separates you from this UFO mythology is that you're looking at what can be analyzed, right? Not what can be speculatively guessed about, but then I think for all of us, there is always this temptation to guess, so now so you'd also mentioned that there were recorded observations showing that UAPs operate at low temperatures and exhibit red and blue shifts that might be similar to a warping of space-time. Do you think that these craft, assuming they're craft, are they doing some kind of a warp drive thing?
Well, that's been some of the suggestions, and that was one suggestion that Lou Elizondo had put out when he presented at the SCU meeting in 2017. So he had mentioned the Alcubierre warp drive, and let's see, I think it's Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis had done some work on, for ATIP, on talking about, doing some of the mathematics of warp bubbles and seeing if you could do something with that with general relativity using Einstein's theory of relativity. So that's a potential, it's a hypothesis that's on the table of how these things might be flying. Again, it's complicated because you have, even in, I'll go to Star Trek because it's the easiest one. So consider the Star Trek Enterprise, right? They have warp drive, but they also have impulse power, right? So sometimes they're flying with impulse power, sometimes they're flying with warp drive, and they can use either. So, it's not clear that these craft are always using the same propulsion techniques, or that different objects are using all the same propulsion techniques. So it's difficult to speak in any generality here.
Well, that's interesting because you've also mentioned that, and I think this has been known in ufology, is strong magnetic fields are involved with UAPs, but not all of the time, right? And the same would be electrical disturbances. Sometimes they're common, but they're not universal. So
yeah, so there's a diversity of objects that we're trying to study here, and there's going to be very likely a diversity of explanations for their origins, for their, what they're doing and how they behave, or how they're engineered, and all of this, and that makes the topic very complicated.
Now, do you in addition to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, there is this idea that some, maybe all of these, if they are vehicles, could be some kind of US government black project, right? Area 51 kind of thing. Do you think that that's a possibility?
It is possible that some of them are. I don't think that all of them are. And there's a few reasons. I mean, the main reason why I don't feel that all of them are is because some of these sightings go back well into the 1800s and earlier. So that becomes problematic. I don't think we had any flying projects before the Wright brothers. So you have a problem there. And I think that's not well understood by a lot of people. And that article that I mentioned from earlier in the interview from the National Fishermen, they talked about several events that happened earlier than the 1960. And I think one of them that I really thought was interesting was this one in 1887, November of 1887.
The Great Airship Mystery, right?
Oh no,
oh. So you were talking about the 1887.
1887, right? So this article talks about a case in November of 1887, and it happened near Cape Race, Newfoundland. And it says another object was observed by an unknown ship, and this was actually reported in the magazine L'Astronomie. The object actually came out of the ocean, and they said it emerged to an altitude of 17 meters. It started moving against the wind and stopped close to the ship observing it, according to the log. And then it rushed away in the sky and disappeared. And it had been viewed for a period of 5 minutes. So there are similar cases, and way back, that's 1887. That's a long time ago.
And similar observed behavior too. That's also very interesting.
Similar observed behavior. Yeah, they have, and they talk about several other cases. They have another case from August 12th, 1910 in the south part of the China Sea. A bright wheel underwater spinning close to the surface was seen from the Dutch ship Valentine. So it was a fascinating article that, that really caught my attention when I was young. Oh, here's the earliest one on record that they could find was from ships was May 15th, 1879, when a ship called the Vulture sailing in the Persian Gulf sighted two giant luminous wheels spinning and slowly descending. They were seen for 35 minutes and had an estimated diameter of 40 meters. So
again, there's a lot of variability as well, you
a
know.
lot of variability, and these sightings go back well into the 1800s. So it's difficult to believe that these aren't all a black project from the US or from some other country.
Do you think that, how difficult do you think that it would be to reconcile some of this? Because again, there is a history to this, as well as a cultural history, right? And again, that's very messy, but to reconcile that with what the military is currently seeing, it seems like at some point that'll have to at least be started, I guess. Do you think there's any way to do that, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know exactly how that will happen. I think once we start learning about what these things are, where they're from, and especially learning about their diversity and why that is and what that means, then I think we'll be able to do a better job of putting things together and figuring out historically what some of these objects were.
Yeah.
I think it's going to give a lot more credence to a lot of these old sightings. You know, once you realize that these things are actually real, and you go back and realize that people have been seeing these for a long time, and you know, there are reports, you know, Roman reports of flying shields. So, and the Japanese called them flying umbrellas. So they've been around for a long time, quite probably.
Okay. Now, it is interesting also. We recently did the APEC conference, and Gary Stevenson did a presentation where he was mentioning UAPs. He'd said that the fact that the UAP went back to the combat assembly point, the cap point, and again, this is, I believe, the 2004 footage, indicates that they understand our transmissions, right? They can
Yeah, so if the whole thing is being spoofed, then whoever spoofed it, if the whole thing was a trick, they really knew what was going on. But the whole cap point, yeah, I think in our paper we mentioned the cap point, the probability of them going back to the cap point is extremely small.
So that brings up another fact, that this is, because then I guess, and this goes to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, you know, do they understand our language or not? You know, lots of questions there, but really some things like that seem to indicate that they probably know just about all there is to know about us.
I would guess that if whoever was operating the Tic Tacs or in control of the, you know, where that Tic Tac went next when it went to the cap point, whoever made that decision clearly knows not only our language, but they can easily unencrypt, you know, our military transmissions and all of this, which, you know, which already is worrisome. But, you know, if they can do that and know our language, they probably know pretty much everything there is to know about us.
And that was my thought. One of the things that I wondered when he mentioned that, the next thing my mind jumped to was, if you can do something like that, then it should be a piece of cake for them to like get online, right? And once you're online, you have access to all the world's information.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. It's kind of like the backwards of what happened in Independence Day, right? So instead of Jeff Goldblum going up and introducing a virus, they could actually do that to us. I never thought about that the other way around. It's funny.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so yeah, that does bring up a lot of big questions, you know. So, well, Kevin, I should thank you for your time again today. I should ask, what comes next for you in this area? I mean, I know you have a presentation coming up in the near future, right, for the SCU,
right.
But and we also have the D&I report, which I think we're all kind of waiting on. But what comes next in the short term?
Yes, I'm still working with UAP expeditions, and we are still planning on on trying to collect data on UAPs. So we're still planning on going to Southern California at some point and trying to observe these things ourselves. I think that's going to happen at some point. I mean, scientists have to start looking to see them. And so, and we have David Mason, our engineer at UAPX, has several military-grade FLIR cameras that we are now using, just basically watching the skies at various points in the country, our backyards. So,
well, you have to start somewhere, right?
You have to start somewhere. So, and we've had some success. And actually, in one of the slides that is in the upcoming presentation, we have a UAP that David Mason filmed from Washington State, where basically that video is interesting because he actually captured it on 2 cameras, so you can rule out artifacts easily. And in one of the cameras, the UAP was following a jet airplane. So the jet airplane flies through the video first, and it's followed by the UAP. And you can see that the 2 look nothing alike. The jet airplane's hot, as you'd expect a machine to be. And these FLIR cameras can give you temperature. And the UAP is this trefoil shape. It looks like a 3-leaf clover. And it's cold. It's about 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, which is quite surprising. And actually, I don't think we got to that point about the Alcubierre and space-time warping. That hypothesis assumes that you're warping space-time to get anti-gravity. So if you're going to keep something aloft this way, then you'd expect there to be anti-gravity on the bottom and gravity on the top, something like that. And that would basically, the strong gravitational fields would basically Doppler shift the black body radiation coming off the craft. So the anti-gravity part would blue shift it, which would give you much higher frequencies. And some people have suggested that maybe this is why people are getting sunburned from being close to UFOs or having some kind of radiation exposures from X-rays because of these blue shifts. But the point that I make in our talk is that the UAPs that we've recorded with the FLIR cameras are actually cold. And so we don't see any of the blue shifting going on that one would expect to see from any space-time warping. So I don't think we see evidence of space-time warping yet.
Okay.
That's really the point there. I don't think I make that very clear in the slides, and I'm probably going to edit them before the talk.
Wonderful. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for your time. I sincerely appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for having me.